You know, I'm a pretty big fan of action games. When a game has a robust enough combat system, an 8-hour game can easily stretch way beyond the average playtime for me. I'm kind of a junkie for this kind of thing, which is why for the past month I've spent most of my time playing Stellar Blade. The game caught my eye a few weeks before release, and when I saw that it resembled some of my favorite games ever in its combat, I knew I had to get it day one. And I'm happy with it. Since release I've beaten the game 3 times and poured 100 hours into it. It's not perfect by any means, but it's got plenty of good stuff going for it, and I would absolutely recommend it to anyone who loves action games. So I want to talk about this combat system and what makes it great. I'll be looking at just about everything combat related, from moveset to equipment, consumables, upgrades, bosses, and everything in between. Keep in mind I'm only going to be speaking about combat in this video, so if you want to hear about the game's side content or the story, you're going to have to go somewhere else. My coverage for combat is going to be mostly positive, but I'll be throwing down some criticisms here and there, because for as much as I love this game, there's definitely a lot that can be improved. There'll be full story spoilers on screen for some bosses, so go play the game yourself if you can. It's worth it. So let's take a close look at the combat of Stellar Blade. Let's begin by laying out some of the basics. Your main attacks consist of light and heavy attacks that can chain into each other, and any of them can be cancelled before the hit connects with an enemy. The amount of combos you can pull off is fairly high, and the game displays every single combo you can do from the skill menu. There's even a dedicated training mode you can use to try out these combos and any skills you get, which is pretty handy. You have a parry that can defend against most attacks except for yellow attacks, which need to be dodged within a tight window. Further expanding on dodging are Blink and Repulse, 2 dodge counters that you can use when enemies attack with blue attacks and purple attacks respectively. Time these correctly and you stun an enemy for a few seconds. None of these are tied to any sort of stamina system, so you're free to run around, attack, and dodge as much as you like. The lack of stamina and the emphasis on combos is a big part of why the Souls-like label doesn't really fit this game, despite it clearly taking inspiration from the Souls series. It's less DS3 and more DMC, less Lies of P and more Nier with 2B, if you know what I mean. If you had to compare it to any Souls game or Souls-like, the best one to do it with would be Sekiro, but remember that even that game was closer to an action game than an RPG like its predecessors. Which is probably why it's better than all of its predecessors, but never mind that. Since I brought up Sekiro, let's talk more in depth about how parrying works in Stellar Blade. Parrying is tied to a system called balance. Every enemy has a set amount of balance blocks or points that you can deplete by parrying their attacks. Depleting every balance point stuns the enemy for a few seconds and leaves them open for a retribution attack that deals a big chunk of damage. If you're familiar with Sekiro, this is going to sound identical to that game's posture system, but there's a few important differences between that and how balance works in Stellar Blade. For one, your character in Stellar Blade doesn't have her own balance points, meaning that getting hit or blocking attacks instead of parrying them doesn't punish you as harshly as Sekiro does. Secondly, aside from one consumable item and certain skills, parrying is the only way to take away balance points, unlike Sekiro where hitting the enemy with anything would deal damage to their posture. This means that combat in Stellar Blade has far more breathing room than Sekiro's does in regards to parrying and balance. Let's demonstrate this by comparing the same scenario in both games. Say you parry a few attacks and then see that the enemy is going to do a combo string that you're not confident you can parry, so you decide to back off and let the enemy swing at nothing. In Sekiro, backing off means you're likely giving the enemy a moment to restore some of its posture, reversing some of the progress you've made towards an insta-kill. This encourages you to be aggressive and either interrupt an enemy string with your own attacks, or just walk up and parry everything they throw at you like an absolute Chad. But in Stellar Blade, because balance damage is permanent, backing off from a dangerous attack is a lot more viable. You're still missing out on an opportunity, but you're not actively losing progress, so there's less consequences for doing it. I don't think either game is strictly better than the other in this regard. While I do prefer Sekiro's posture system and how it pushes you to take everything head on, Stellar Blade's balance system works well too, and it makes perfect sense for the kind of pace the game has. Given how many combos there are and how quickly you can perform most of them, it makes sense to opt for a system where balance damage is permanent, but your options for that damage are more limited. If Sekiro's posture system was copied 1-to-1, then enemies would have to have massive balance bars, otherwise it would be far too easy to break them, so I think the way it works now is completely fine. But that's it for parries and balance. For now, let's move on and talk about consumables. Let's start with healing. Stellar Blade gives 4 healing items throughout the game: the rechargeable tumbler, lingering potion, concentrated potion, and biotic field generator. The tumbler works a lot like the Estus flask in Dark Souls. They heal you a lot, but you can only get them back by resting at camps. You start with 3 of these, but you can increase them by doing side quests and exploring the world, with the highest count to my knowledge being 8. Concentrated potions heal for slightly less than tumblers, while lingering potions heal about the same amount but over a short period of time. Biotic generators heal for a good chunk, but only if you're standing within its heal radius. These 3 don't replenish at camps, you have to buy them, and the only way to increase your capacity is by getting more of the collectible cans spread throughout the world. Now, as far as utility goes, everything besides the tumbler just feels incredibly redundant. Not only is the game fairly easy even on hard mode, meaning that you won't be healing constantly, but the tumbler just heals you too much. The other items aren't faster or give you any sort of advantage over the tumbler, so they fall out of use really quickly. They could have been made more useful if they offered something like, say, a damage boost, or just make them heal you more than the tumbler. Anything to encourage you to buy them, really. As they are now, they get some use in the early game, but then just sit in your inventory collecting dust in the late game. They're pretty wasteful. Let's shift focus a bit and talk about grenades. Throughout the game, you'll get impact, pulse, and sonic grenades, as well as smart mines. Sonic grenades deal balance damage, while pulse grenades deal shield damage. These 2 types are simple, but they work well. My only complaint is that I wish pulse grenades dealt a bit more damage to shields given how limited the initial capacity is. Smart mines are honestly not very useful. I had to remind myself that these exist. Not only do they deal pitiful damage and barely stun the enemy, but if you're close to its blast radius, you'll take damage and get stunned yourself. It's more of a hazard than anything else. The most important of these is the impact grenade, which temporarily downs the enemy, letting you get some cheap hits in. And when I say enemy, I mean any enemy. Every enemy. Needless to say, these are the best grenades in the game. Grenades are an okay addition to combat. Smart mines are kinda useless, but every other type is a good way to supplement your offense, impact grenades especially. Before I move on and talk more about equipment, let me direct your eyes to the bottom left of the screen. Healing items and grenades are used by pressing up and down the D-pad respectively, and you switch to different types by holding down their respective buttons and entering an item wheel. Now, if you've never played Stellar Blade, you might see that the left and right directions on the D-pad are completely empty and think, what are these used for? If you're in this camp, then I'm glad you asked, because the answer is actually really surprising. Left and right on the D-pad are used for nothing. I'm serious, they don't do anything. You can't set grenades or healing items to either of these, and they're not used for any other mechanic in the game. You can even go into the pause menu and confirm it. These buttons do nothing, and it's insane. Think about how much smoother combat would be if you could put 2 grenades on either side of these instead of having to pause the action when you want to switch. It's baffling that these are never used when the games they clearly took inspiration from were never this wasteful with their D-pads. Shit, at least let me put the fishing rod in here. Oh well. I brought up shields a moment ago, so let's talk about those for a moment. Shields feel like a very superficial addition to the game. Basically, both you and the enemies have a shield gauge that reduces incoming damage for every shield level. In all of my playthroughs, that damage reduction barely mattered on both my end and the enemies. As the player, it only becomes significant when you go to either extreme of having a ton of shield enhancements, or wearing the skin suit which disables shields entirely. Even with the shield enhancements, you're honestly better off enhancing other parts of your arsenal since you can heal so easily. Shields aren't much better on the enemy's end. There is a somewhat noticeable increase in damage when you deplete their shields, but the only part of an enemy's shield that really matters is that depleting them will stun them for a moment. It's pretty short, but it's long enough that you can get a few hits in, and it can be a good way to interrupt some boss attacks without spending any major resources. Shields aren't a bad idea, but if they're going to be kept around for a sequel, then they should be a lot more significant than they are now. Otherwise, they're just kinda wasted. Now let's talk about the 2 main pieces of equipment, exospines and gears. Exospines are typically just direct enhancements to your existing arsenal, things like increased range damage or easier parries and perfect dodges. There are some that are a bit more special though, like increasing the effectiveness of grenades, or my personal favorite, increasing your skill bar for executing a long combo. You start out with just 1 exospine slot, but you get a second one at around the halfway point of the game. Once you have that second one, the combat really opens up. There's enough variety in exospines that you can craft your own playstyle if you pair them up with the right gears. It's pretty good. Speaking of gears, these are equipment that are completely separate from exospines, but like exospines, they're usually just stat increases. You can use up to 4 of them, and each gear gets its own star rating from 1 to 3. You can stack up to 3 of them of the same kind so long as they're a different rating from each other. It's these things that make shields a lot more substantial once you get some shield-focused gears going. I want to highlight my 2 favorite types of gears though, the double-edged gears and the speed increase gears. The double-edged gears increase your damage output at the cost of increasing your incoming damage. It's not that big of a difference at the start, but stack 3 of these in the late game and you're dealing 60% more damage at the cost of taking double damage. If you're a glutton for punishment like I am, you're probably never going to take these off during a normal mode run, since they add just a bit more challenge to the game. The speed increase gears on the other hand are even cooler, since they increase the speed of all of your attacks. Now I think the base attack speed is perfectly fine as it is, but equipping even one of these gears makes the default speed look downright sluggish. Stack 3 of these and your attack speed increases by nearly 30%. It's like you're playing Devil May Cry on turbo mode, it's great. Overall, exospines and gears are mostly good. I wish there were more gears like the speed increase gears that make more substantial changes to the gameplay besides number go up, but there's still enough of them that they're fun to play around with. Let's move on from these and talk about something I've been alluding to this whole time. It's time to talk about my favorite part of this combat system: beta and burst. From the very start of the game, you have what is called a beta gauge. Filling the beta gauge by at least 2 blocks lets you use beta skills, which are your main form of damage throughout the game. The beta skills themselves are fairly simple, but they get more interesting with upgrades. There's Triplet, which begins as a basic damage dealer, but when you upgrade it to become Quartet, it gets an extension that decreases the enemy's balance. There's Crescent Slash, which is mainly good for crowd control, Shockwave, which is a ranged attack, and Shield Breaker, which, as the name implies, is mainly for targeting shields. All of these have their uses, but Quartet and Shield Breaker are the best of these, with Shield Breaker arguably being the best, since the fully upgraded version lets you down enemies for a short time if you charge up the attack. The skills are pretty fun to use, but what's more interesting about the beta system is that it also allows you to change the properties of your combo finishers. By holding down the attack button at the end of a combo, you can use up 1 block of beta to deal extra damage and stun the enemy for a second or two. Initially, this might get you tempted to play the game like Sekiro. Parry everything at every opportunity so you can fill up the beta gauge faster and get closer to a retribution. While you can play the game like this, and it's definitely fun to do so, there is incentive to avoid limiting yourself like this, and that incentive is the burst gauge. At around the halfway point of the game, you get access to the burst gauge and burst skills. The burst gauge is completely separate from the beta gauge, and the burst skills have their own properties. The burst skills are Punishing Edge, which is an even better form of crowd control than Crescent Slash and even downs enemies once you upgrade it. There's Descending Break, which both downs the enemies and takes off 2 blocks of balance if it hits. There's Tempest, which is good for breaking shields and a nice treat for Vergil enjoyers. And then there's my personal favorite, Overdrive, which increases both your attack power and attack speed. This attack speed stacks on top of the speed increase gears, so you can imagine I was happy to slash away like a crackhead. Now there's 2 main ways you can fill up the burst gauge. The first is to use your beta combo finishers, and the second is by using your dodges. That is, the perfect dodge and countering with blink and repulse. I love the way beta and burst interact with each other because they give you a huge list of ways you can approach combat. You can stand your ground, slowly whittling away the enemy with parries and the occasional skill. You can be more mobile, iframing as many attacks as possible and focusing more on burst skills. You can do a little bit of both and swap between parrying and dodging to keep both of your gauges at equal level. But my favorite way to play is what I call relentless offense. Slap on the beta and burst exospines, 2 speed increase gears, and your choice of beta recharge or burst recharge gears. Then when you fight, constantly go for short combos, finishing every single one with a beta extension to increase your burst, and then use overdrive to stun the enemy and get those combos out even faster, which means faster burst recharge, which means faster beta recharge, and round you go until the enemy is dead on the floor wondering what the hell just happened. I love this playstyle a lot, even if it's probably too strong. I'll end the section by reiterating that this is the best part of Stellar Blade's combat. Beta and Burst just offer so many viable approaches to combat that it becomes great, even if some of those options are a bit overtuned. Sadly, that's gonna be the most positive thing I'll say about combat for a while. It's time to talk about some aspects of combat that are a bit less stellar, starting with Taki Mode. The last major combat feature you get in Stellar Blade is Taki Mode. It's basically a superpowered state that you charge up by dealing damage. Entering it makes you immune to damage, though not immune to hit stun, gives you a set of skills exclusive to the mode, and makes all of your attacks stun enemies. The catch with this mode is that you don't recharge beta or burst while you're in it, and you can't damage an enemy's balance either. To be honest, Taki Mode is just kinda boring. Not only is there little consequence for using it, but there's no interesting interactions with the combat when you enter it. It's pretty much a way to get free damage on bosses, or as a panic button whenever a fight gets too crowded. If you want to see this concept done better, look at Sin Devil Trigger in Devil May Cry 5. For one, you have to give up a good chunk of Devil Trigger gauge just to enter the mode, and once you're on it, you have way more options. You're not immune to damage, meaning you still have to be a little careful, you have way more options to clear large crowds, and you have Quadruple S, which lets you skip animations for entering and exiting this mode if your style ranking is maxed out. Granted, you can use Sin Devil Trigger as an Onga Bunga deal big damage button, but I hope that I've shown you that there's still more going on with it compared to Taki Mode, which is far more shallow. I think Taki Mode isn't a bad idea, but the execution is incredibly lacking, and if there's ever a Stellar Blade 2, I hope it's a feature that gets reworked to have more interesting options. But believe it or not, Taki Mode isn't actually my least favorite part of combat. No, that title goes to the gun. Early on in the game, your drone gets the ability to become a gun. You get 5 different ammo types for the gun: slug rounds, which are just regular bullets, shotgun shells, which deal a ton of damage up close, blaster cells which deal a ton of damage but need to be charged up, stinger missiles which need to lock onto enemies, and explosive rounds that explode on impact. The gun is by far the biggest waste of potential in the game, more so than Taki mode, more so than the D-pad, and you might be able to tell what the problem is just by watching the footage. It's slow. Every time you want to use the gun, you have to wait half a second to enter this aiming mode, and once you're in it, your movement becomes incredibly limited. In terms of utility, the gun isn't all that bad, in some ways it's actually kinda strong. Stinger missiles deal huge damage to enemy shields, and using the shotgun shells up close can do a lot of damage, for example. There's even some incentive to use the gun in the form of repulse counter, since every time you pull it off, enemies will expose a weak point that you're meant to shoot at for extra damage. But because your movement is so limited while aiming, I very rarely used it because it just halted the pace of combat. To add insult to injury, you can't even swap between ammo types quickly. You have to pause the game to enter the weapon wheel, yet again completely wasting the D-pad. That's all it comes down to, really. In a game where combat is fairly quick, having a tool that slows it down like this just feels bad. It's not completely unsalvageable though. I think the solution isn't to remove the gun entirely, but rather to give it quicker options. Let me play armchair developer for a minute and list some ways that the gun can be improved to keep the combat fast. Slug rounds could be fired off the lock-on mode like in Nier Automata. The mag size would probably have to increase and enemies might have to have some way to defend against it, but it's a start. This quickfire mode could also be set to aim for center mass and ignore weak points. That way players would still need to enter manual aiming whenever they expose them. Shotgun shells could borrow the Gunstinger ability from Devil May Cry, letting you close the gap on an enemy and ending the motion with a shot. You can kind of already do this in Stellar Blade, but making it a single input like Gunstinger would make it a lot smoother. Stinger missiles could also borrow something from Devil May Cry, namely Kalina Ann's Hysteric. Hysteric in DMC is slow, arguably slower than aiming in Stellar Blade, but the ability could be reworked to shoot faster. It would be a good tool for crowd control. Explosive rounds could borrow Kalina Ann's Air Shot, giving the gun some utility in the air, or it could be worked into the perfect dodge, similar to how you can counter with a drone in Nier Automata. Blaster cells can mostly stay the same since they're meant to build up slowly and leave you standing still, but they could also be charged up outside of aiming mode like how the blue rose works in Devil May Cry 4 and 5. Alternatively, the charge shot could damage you. Near the end of the game, there's a sequence where you have to shoot a superpowered shot at a boss, and using it takes away some of your health. Maybe this could be worked into my hypothetical quick charge by taking away some of your health if you hold onto the shot for too long. And that's it. Those are my ideas. They're not perfect, but I hope I've shown there's at least a few ways the gun could be used in combat without having to slow the pace down. We've gone through just about everything the player can do, so let's shift focus. Let's talk about bosses and what's probably the biggest issue with Stellar Blade, the game's balance. The bosses in Stellar Blade are easily the most fun combat encounters. They're pushed onto you at a good pace, and they generally demand a good mix of parrying and dodging. There's a weird quirk in that some bosses in the late game have insta-kill attacks, where you're meant to shoot some weak points with the gun within a time limit or just die instantly, which feels kinda tacked on, especially since they're pretty easy to interrupt. Still, I really like the bosses, and I think the developers are pretty proud of them, given that they added a boss challenge mode after launch. But given that they're getting a whole section in this video, I don't think they're perfect. I'll start with my most minor issues and work my way up. There are a handful of bosses that get reused for side quests. The main story won't force you into any rematches, but it's still a bit lame to hear about an optional boss you can fight and it's just a boss you fought a while back with like 2 or 3 new moves. It's not a big deal, but I felt it was worth bringing up. Another slightly petty issue I have is how you almost never use the environment during bosses. In the intro level, there's a section where the game advises you to hit the red barrels around the combat arena to thin out a crowd of enemies. Later, when you fight the first boss, the arena has some red barrels spread around that you can use to deal big chunks of damage to the boss. The way this is implemented is a bit clumsy since the blast radius is really small, but I like the idea of using the environment to give yourself an advantage. Problem is, outside of this one optional boss and a side quest, this kind of thing never happens again. Ever. No explosive barrels or any way to use the environment, not in the boss fight at least. I don't want to be too harsh on the game for this, since even the best action games rarely make the environment a part of the fight, but it's especially disappointing here since the game went out of its way to point out this option and then never used it again. It's a big missed opportunity. But never mind the small stuff. Let's look at the biggest issue with these fights. It's something I've been hinting at throughout the video, and if you've been paying attention to the footage, you probably figured out the issue already. It is way too easy to stun lock bosses in this game. Think about how many things in this game either put enemies into hit stun or straight up knock them down. Combo extensions can stun, 3 of your beta skills can stun, every burst skill stuns, every attack in Taki mode stuns, and that's before talking about knockdowns. Descending Break causes knockdown, a fully charged Shield Breaker causes knockdown, Impact Grenades cause knockdown, And to make things even worse, you can get an extra spine that extends the amount of time an enemy spends in knockdown and increases the damage they take while knocked down. At some point, part of the challenge of bosses is holding yourself back from using too much of your arsenal. If you don't, then every fight ends up looking like this. And the only thing stopping the bosses from being stuck in a fucking infinite is either phase changes or winding up an insta-kill. I'm not completely against hit stun or knockdowns on bosses, but there really needed to be some sort of cap for them. Something like, say, making bosses immune to hit stun unless you deplete their shields, or making them immune to knockdowns unless you get their balance down to a certain point. Just something that makes the fights less one-sided. I know it's a bit ironic to complain about this when earlier I was just saying that my favorite playstyle is similar to this. Oh, while I do enjoy doing it, I think it should be something that only happens if you're specifically building for it. Even if I wasn't tailoring my playstyle to turn bosses into punching bags, I still have to be mindful to not use too many good skills in order to keep the fight somewhat fair, and I think that really needs to be looked at. Even with all of these problems, I still really enjoy the bosses. I'm pretty happy that we got a boss rush mode after launch, since these are easily the most fun fights in the game, Elder Natiba and Raven being the ones that stand out the most. They've got a great thing going with the boss design. All that's needed is some balance changes and they'll be as close to perfect as can be. That's it for bosses. I've gone through almost everything I want to talk about by now, so let me just take a moment to talk about Hard Mode and New Game Plus before wrapping up for good. New Game Plus in Stellar Blade doesn't actually change much. There's no remixed enemy placements or new twists on bosses, it's a really simple carry over all your things kind of New Game Plus. The most significant thing about New Game Plus is the addition of one extra upgrade for every beta skill. These upgrades don't change the skill's properties, but they do give each of them some extra damage and change their animations, which are pretty cool. Other than that, not much changes. Playing hard on New Game Plus makes the game a cakewalk, and in some ways it's even easier than New Game Normal. Not that you can't spice things up a little, mind you. At the start of the video, I said that I've done 3 playthroughs for this game. The first was on Normal, where I did every side quest and got every skill. The second was on New Game Plus Hard, where I mostly speedran through the main story. And the third was on New Game Hard, with the added catch that I played the whole thing wearing the skin suit outfit, which completely disables your shields. I enjoyed my time with all of these playthroughs, but it was actually the skin suit only playthrough that I enjoyed the most. Since enemies are buffed and you can't take advantage of shields, every single encounter was dangerous. Bosses were especially intense because just making one mistake would get you killed. This is the run where I felt I understood the combat at a deeper level, and it made me appreciate some of the finer details, while also making me realize its biggest flaws. It was frustrating as hell at many points, but it was also super rewarding. Part of me wishes this was a dedicated difficulty setting. You can kinda do it in Boss Rush, but having it for the main game would be sweet too. It's a good way to mix things up for a playthrough. And that's it. That's about all I have to say about Stellar Blade's combat. Looking back at the script, I feel like I may have come off as more negative than I really am, so let me make this clear. I really like this game. I've got no regrets about spending 100 hours with it, and hell, I'll probably put in another 20 or so before I put it down for good. Really, most of my issues with the game can be fixed with the idea of make it more difficult. Make the bosses more threatening, make the player's kit less overpowered while still keeping a good amount of variety. What I complain about the most is the gun, and even then I don't want to change completely, I just want to have more options. At the end of the day, Shiftout did a fantastic job for their first real game, and I'm excited to see what that rumored Project Witches is gonna look like. Stellar Blade is already a solid base to build off of, and I'm sure they can only improve with time. This game is great, and I have faith that whatever they put out next is going to be truly stellar.